Hey, how are you? 30 shy 1%.
Hello, this is Tom Wagner. I'll be the narrator of the podcast you're listening to today. It corresponds with the article I wrote for my Sunday Morning Cafe blog dated May 3rd, 2026. It really kind of gets to the heart of my resilience research, and I'll be interested in seeing what it brings up in you. Unbroken, Part 3, Larry's Pilgrimage to Freedom. Even if it kills me, I'm not going back. Soaked in blood from a gash to his head, 17-year-old Larry shivered under a viaduct for 2 cold Covington, Kentucky November nights. After 14 years, Larry was seeing to it that his beating from the night before would be his last. Larry's stepdad was like a cruel slave owner. He was a sociopath, a monster really. There was no way he was going to allow Larry to get away. Larry's road to freedom was just on the other side of a long, exposed walkway over Spence Bridge where his friend Brian and his family lived in Cincinnati. Now, Dick wasn't used to any of his sons or stepsons fighting back. It had been years since Larry's 3 older brothers escaped from home, which left Larry, the youngest, in the horrible position of being the sole target, the sole scapegoat for Dick's rage. Larry knew that if the police found him trying to get away like this, they'd reunite him with his stepdad, a guy whose capacity for violence and revenge didn't have any limits at all. Dark rumors of murder fit this guy like a tailor-made suit. Larry didn't want to give him a chance to show what he was capable of. Hiding out for 2 cold nights, Larry remembers thinking, even if this kills me, I'm not going back. Hypothermia appeared to be a small price to pay for his freedom. Larry's history of living with Dick, his stepdad, was bookended by impossibly hard blows to the head. The first one, at 4 years old, left him sprawled out on the floor of a car. The final one, at 17, left him momentarily sprawled out, this time on a kitchen floor. But unlike his 4-year-old initiation into abuse, and unlike the following 14 years of beatings, as often as not with weapons, this time, after getting up off the floor, he pushed back. The combination of teenage strength and the abuser's surprise bought Larry just enough time to get out the door. Next thing you know, he found himself on a 2-night, 5-mile sojourn to his buddy Brian's house, where he lived out the rest of his senior year. It was during that year that Larry defiantly proved Dick wrong. You might recall from the last article, Dick's final words to him, "You'll never amount to anything. You'll never graduate high school." Hiding in the neighbor's bushes after he got out the door, Larry whispered to himself, "The hell I won't." After receiving his diploma, Larry completed a stint with the Navy. Then he settled down to a 35-year career as an electrician. He's retired now, enjoys the fruits of having raised 2 boys and 2 stepkids. He has 10 grandchildren, and he enjoys them very, very much. He and his wife of 34 years take their winters together in Florida, and they've been known to take the occasional cruise vacation, for reasons you're about to find out. Next section, entitled Walking with a Limp. Unlike a 2-dimensional superhero who always comes out unscathed and unscratched, violence, cruelty, and poverty tend to leave a mark on a person. Resilience is not the same thing as invulnerability. Like Jacob in the Old Testament, those resilient souls like Larry that live amongst us frequently walk with a limp. Larry is no exception. The past 2 episodes of Sunday Morning Cafe have asked the question, where did Larry get hold of his resilience? In this 3rd and final installment, we return to Larry's story to ask, how does someone heal from such dramatic abuse? As Larry described in the first episode of this trilogy, Dick was always looking for a place to put his anger. A wrong answer to a question, a return trip from a bar, or just even looking at him the wrong way. often resulted in boys getting lined up against the wall for a whipping with an extension cord. In Larry's words, and this is a trigger warning for anybody who wants to avoid being triggered with a traumatic experience. In Larry's words, the whipping would be front, back, up, and down, administered to those boys' naked bodies. Larry's voice was grim as he remembered. It felt like fire. Skin broke, blood flowed, welts rose up, and bruises spread out. Those physical effects just give you some clue as to the psychological and spiritual scars that cruelty like this can furrow into a boy's soul. A minute ago, I asked, how does someone heal from such dramatic abuse? To get a hold of that answer, I invite you to load up your imaginative backpack and travel back in time with me for an adventure with 4 little boys that could have come straight out of the movie Stand By Me. Except, we'll entitle our little movie taken out of Larry's past, Healing at the Quarry. So, where do boys go? What do boys do to heal from that kind of abuse? What follows, in Larry's own words, is a description of what I interpret to be 4 boys' efforts at applying a healing salve to their broken bodies and their wounded souls. Let's hear it in Larry's words. It would begin sometime in March. We'd take the railroad tracks down to the quarry. Sometimes there'd still be ice along the edges, but we'd still jump into the water. Then you'd find a sunny place after that to lay out on the huge boulders that were heated by the sun. Next section I entitled Shinrin Yoku. These words of Larry made me think of the Japanese concept of Shinrin Yoku, which literally translates into English as forest bathing. People who enjoy this form of spirituality experience a kind of restoration or rejuvenation by plunging into nature for a hike, or in Larry and his brother's case, by literally plunging into icy water. As Larry spoke, it wasn't hard to imagine this little band of brothers reclaiming their boyhoods. That cold, cold water wouldn't have left any room for lingering memories of violence. Here at the quarry was a kind of home where you didn't have to watch your words or your back. When Larry described this scene, I could hear the warmth in his voice as he relived these moments of stretching out on slabs of rock warmed by sweet, golden, wholesome light. Now, I know that if I could go back in time and interview those swimmer sunbathers, I'm pretty sure that the word healing never would have crossed their boy lips or their boy consciousness. Likewise, words like spiritual or transcendent or even God wouldn't have occurred to them either. As I listened to adult Larry, the eyes of my imagination glanced back and forth between side-by-side scenes. On the one side, I was looking at those sun-warmed rocks and Hakuna Matata. On the other side of the screen was the bracing scenes from Passion of the Christ, where the splades would come up of bloody extension cord whips. It occurred to me that these boys' bodies were frequently forced to absorb pain and humiliation, but never ever at the quarry. At the quarry, their bodies experienced exhilaration. They experienced warmth, relaxation, and play. The quarry gave their bodies a kind of kinetic experience, an experience of beauty in boy motion. Now, spiritual writers have long considered beauty as just another name for God or God's presence. So from that perspective, it's not a stretch to imagine that those boys were unconsciously experiencing an unnamed healing presence. It was that same unnamed healing presence that showed up for Larry years later during night watch when he was in the Navy. Let me tell you about that with the next section that I've entitled A Rendezvous with Healing Presence. Quote, "There's something healing in me," end quote. Sometimes healing presence shows up through years of spiritual discipline, practices like meditation, sacred ritual, or hanging out in a spiritual community of support. At other times, it shows up seemingly out of nowhere. It was that second way of these two experiences that showed up for Larry. It's more like he bumped into divine presence. To put it in the words of a mystic like St. Augustine, Larry didn't know he was looking for God when God found Larry. As a young man in the Navy, late at night, he'd steal away to the back of a huge vessel that was called a fast frigate. He and his crew were on that ship to guard an even larger aircraft carrier. Here's how Larry described it for me in his own words. Looking up at the stars and the bioluminescence of the fantail, which is the wake left by the boat, it put everything in perspective. I did feel like God was there, especially at night. There's a dark that's darker than dark. The ship is way out in the middle of the ocean, but I always felt so comfortable. It was very calming. It was then that I felt there's something healing in me. In his book, Into the Silent Land, spiritual theologian Martin Laird described the phenomenon that Larry just shared. He said in his own words, that is Martin Laird's words, it's as if there's something inside that's deeper than the pain, deeper than the anxiety, deeper than the trauma. In experiences like the one Larry described, Laird said that the chaos of the mind is quieted. The sense of anguish gives way to a sense of divine presence. On those nights that Larry described as darker than dark, the comfort he felt came from a deeper place than the layers of abuse he'd suffered. In fact, according to Larry, his 14 years of cruelty were not an impediment to accessing that presence. Here, listen to his own words. As a young man, I should have been too busy to look for all that stuff. I wasn't too busy. If I would have had a normal childhood, I wouldn't have been looking for something more. My abusive past created a need to go to the back of that boat and to look up. Now, Larry was clearly not saying that he was glad for all that abuse. Like sufferers of many stripes, Larry is saying that his psychological pain caused him to search. What Larry discovered at the quarry and on the back of that boat was a source of healing that attracted him, that seemed to desire healing for him. Which brings me to my final section that I've entitled A Spiritual Takeaway. In my spiritual tradition of Catholicism, there's an old belief in a thing that St. Augustine called original sin. That belief was meant to explain how people like Larry's stepdad can go so very, very wrong. Having said that, Larry's story reveals something more, a story more ancient and all-pervasive, a thing we might call original blessing. This original blessing predates original sin, and it exists further in and deeper down within each of us, kind of like an aquifer or an underground water system somewhere below our unconscious self. This deep down place inside Larry was a place that his stepdad couldn't get to and therefore couldn't take from him. It's what eventually led Larry to the back of a boat to look up. And in looking up, Larry fell down into the source of beauty itself. That source, come to find out, had always lived within him, before all the pain. It was original blessing that pulled him down a railroad track with a ragtag band of brothers to bask on sun-baked slabs of rock. Likewise, years later, the source of that original blessing attracted him to the back of a boat to initiate a healing process within him. Now, whether you had a normal childhood or a childhood that lived closer to the end of the spectrum where Larry's lived, the takeaway from this story is the same. And what is that? Just this. The human spirit miraculously and mysteriously comes ready-made with a source of healing presence knit into its deepest fibers. Even more miraculously, it appears as though all of creation comes with that same presence knit into it that calls out to us, calls out to that deepest place within us, that place of original blessing. Unfortunately, it doesn't appear that this healing presence that's part of our inmost self and all of creation prevents any of us from experiences of chaos or cruelty. But Larry's story bears a kind of witness that violence and damage doesn't have to get the last word. Now, here's the point in the podcast where I can let you know that if you don't want to listen to these questions for reflection that I'm going to give you, you can just go right on over to the written blog and pull it up, and they're written down for you to just kind of go over, savor, and reflect. But for those of you that stay on this podcast, here's some questions for you. First one, it's the question I almost always ask of my readers. What stood out for you in this podcast or this article? And why do you think it speaks to you? Here comes a second question. Has there been anything in your life that caused you some trauma or has gotten in your way psychologically or spiritually? Third question kind of attaches to the second one. Is there a way in which you kind of walk with a limp as a result of past trauma or wound? And what helps you make your way with that limp? Here's my final question. When I was a boy, Lake Springfield was just a short walk away from me. The rhythm of its waves and the underwater silence that it gave me stilled my soul in the midst of family chaos. Larry found his way to an anonymous source of healing presence at the quarry and then later in the back of that boat. Can you think of times where you kind of accidentally found your way to places like that? Recall one or two of these stories, just taking a moment to savor those spots again in your imagination and maybe in conversation. All right, I'll see you again next week.